Okay, brilliant. Okay, I think we probably will make a start now then, if that's okay with everybody. So welcome to this latest instalment of our YQSR, that is the Yorkshire Quality and Safety Research Group webinar series. For those of you that don't know me, I am Jane O'Hara. I'm a Professor of Healthcare Quality and Safety based at the University of Leeds, but I'm also Deputy Director of the YQSR Group. Before we start, there's a few housekeeping things. Even though we're virtual, there are still some housekeeping things. I'm just going to go through those now. It would be great if everybody could turn their cameras off during the talk and also their microphones. We are expecting quite a lot of people tonight, so it would be better, I think, if we could reduce the amount of noise particularly, so that would be appreciated. As you can see, we are recording the seminar, and we are planning to upload it, the recording, to our YQSR YouTube channel. And that's so that obviously anybody can access it after the event. So we will send out the link after we've finished. We would love to take all of your questions, but we would ask that you put any questions into the chat function. Please do that when they occur to you during the talk, or of course at the end. What we'll do if you're putting them in during the talk is sort of make a note of them, and then I will ask Joe those questions at the end, just to make sure that it's as smooth as possible. Okay, so our speaker tonight is a lovely colleague and friend, Jo Wailling. Jo is a registered nurse, a research fellow and facilitator with the Diana Unwin Chair in Restorative Justice based at the University of Wellington in New Zealand. Jo has worked as a registered nurse in NHS critical care settings for 13 years before she moved to New Zealand, and has over 20 years experience in clinical, professional and government advisory roles. Jo's going to talk to us today about her work exploring the potential of restorative approaches to supporting healing following healthcare adverse events. Jo will discuss her innovative use of these approaches to address the harm caused to patients and professionals by the use of surgical mesh. So I'm going to turn my camera off now, Jo, and it's over to you.
Thanks, Jane. Kia ora, everybody. That's how we say hello here in New Zealand. It's good to see you or not see you here. First of all, thanks, Jane, for the intro. I'm going to talk a little bit about the impacts of our current approaches to incidents. So some of you that have seen me speak before might be familiar with some of that conceptual ideas. And then I'm going to talk about the potential for restorative approaches and what they are, a little bit about some lessons from our inquiry into surgical mesh. And I'm also going to try and respond to some of the common queries that have come up for me working in healthcare and the restorative area over the last few years. So it's long been established that harm is devastating and prolific in healthcare environments. Sir Don Berwick, the father of the OHI, said this way back in 2002. And this is the World Health Organization's definition of safety, which describes reducing the risk of iatrogenic harm. And that occurs when medical or surgical treatment causes a new illness or injury. But who decides what harm is necessary and what harm is acceptable is very much open to interpretation. And those that are most impacted by the harm are usually not involved in its determination. And I think that the way that we've defined harm previously has actually limited our understanding and also shaped how we respond to it. Because, as I'm sure many of you know, there's multiple factors that can cause harm in healthcare environments, and they're very much connected to and influence each other. But whatever the cause, the common thread is that there's people that are hurt, and these unique needs emerge from the harm. And there generally tend to be these two key narratives, which many of you will be familiar with, about who is affected following a serious incident. And the first is that the patient or their family member is affected, and the second is that it's the health professional, the health provider that's affected. And this discourse aligns with the traditional notions of justice, where there's a victim of harm and someone or something or an organisation or an entity that's caused the harm. But we know in complex health system that intentional harm is rare. There's multiple contributory factors. Lots of people are involved and contribute to an incident as everyone interacts with each other and their context as well. So I'm sure many of you have heard of a just culture, and that attempts to recognise that actually individuals are rarely to blame for an incident, and it's increasingly advocated in safety investigations. So this is NHS England's Serious Incident Framework, and they tend to ask, they want to seek to understand what happened, why it happened, how it happened, and what can be done to stop it happening to somebody else. And the way we go about answering those questions is usually using methods that seek to understand cause, remove hazards, explore systemic weaknesses, and provide opportunities for system learning. But they actually miss out often thinking about how we might respond to the human needs that emerge. And these investigations are usually led in a framework like this. This is New Zealand's health system. So lots of different regulatory bodies involved, very much within a linear framework with a designated expert leading the investigation, and very much characterised by retrospective document review, lots of written documentation, some interviews maybe, and expert opinion. And we know from the evidence that the recommendations are very much influenced from the questions we ask and the investigator's perspective. And they can often be quite weak for system learning, which is often the goal. So the people that are actually affected by the harm, they're not usually involved in designing the actual investigation or reviewing the evidence or designing the actions for repair and prevention. They're normally seen as a resource for learning. And what that actually means is that instead of starting from a position where we recognise that there's multiple perspectives on a serious incident, we instead have these competing stories. And in the end, one of them is decided to be more worthy or more truthful or more accurate than another one, as multiple parties are affected, and these opinions can also change over time. And the case that comes to mind when I think about that is is Jack Adcock's death. And what we do in this search to diagnose and treat the system, we unintentionally end up dehumanizing the person who's died or is injured. And in that way, we then compound the harm with these multiple retrospective processes that often go on for a very long time. And as people feel unheard, they seek voice and they seek agency through other means. And we end up with advocates that are unpaid, unsupported resources, and they carry this additional burden of the suffering of others. And often when they've worked really hard to change the system, that we then see repetitive inquiries that illustrate that those conditions haven't changed, and they compound the harm further, such as what we've seen recently in maternity investigations. So even here in New Zealand, this is the amazing founder of Mesh Down Under, Carmel Berry. We've got a no fault, no injury system, so you can't sue, and patients' rights are enshrined in a code of rights and the law here. But even with these magic ingredients, we found through the Mesh inquiry that these traditional investigative methods, they compound the harm, and they place the burden of proof on patients and families and on the health professionals that are impacted. And these actually compound the harm. And what we heard from both health professionals and from messengered patients and families is it actually leaves them feeling dehumanized and abandoned and depressed and often suicidal. And international research, including in our country, indicates that health professionals involved in these events often have similar feelings and experiences. So what is compounded harm? I've mentioned it a few times, and this is the definition that I developed with my Canadian colleagues, Ali and Caroline. Ali's here on the call, I think. So compounded harm arises when there's a failure by a responsible party, and we'll come back to what they are later, to give an account to an affected party. So that's someone who's harmed, whether it be a consumer, that's what we call patients and families here, or a health professional, or their family, or whānau. And whānau is a word in New Zealand that means extended families and friends. For harm that occurs because of the provision of care. And compounded harm is experienced as betrayal, a loss of trust, disempowerment, abandonment, and unjustified blame. And if it remains unaddressed, as we saw in our mesh inquiry, it grows and it speeds and it spreads, and it evolves and it intensifies as well. So what do people actually want? Well, like victims in justice settings, patients and families and health professionals impacted by a serious incident want to be heard, they want to be believed, and they want to be dignified. And they want a response that treats all of the people involved with care and compassion and promotes healing, one that's founded in these espoused values and beliefs in health institutions all over the world, and one that preserves dignity. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about dignity here. So dignity has been bandied around quite a lot in NHS policies and care campaigns, as it has here in New Zealand. But we're still failing to create the conditions for dignity to be enhanced in the way that respond to incidents. And Donna Hicks is an international conflict resolution specialist at Harvard University. She's a professor, and she describes dignity as this glue that holds all our relationships together, and the mutual recognition of a desire to be seen, to be heard, to be listened to and treated fairly, to be recognised and understood and feel safe in the world. And these are the kinds of components that ensure that someone feels dignified. So when we're thinking about restoration, it is that restoration, preservation of dignity. Now, it's become quite obvious to all of us during the pandemic that our health and well-being and our ability to trust is very much dependent on our relationships and our connections with each other. And I'm sure you can also think of another time in your lives where relationships have enhanced or eroded your feelings of self-worth or well-being or identity. And we actually found as well in our research that safety influence is a responsive relational process as well, rather than an act of regulation or enforcement. And when we understand that safe healthcare delivery is about relationships as well as regulatory frameworks, we recognise that if we want a resilient health system, we have to understand that safety is created from this human capacity for learning and growth and development that comes through connection and collaboration. So when we understand that health systems are comprised of people and relationships, as are societies, we understand then that when a serious incident occurs, that it is people that are harmed and relationships that are affected. So whilst understanding what happened before the injury or the harm occurred is really important, what happens afterwards is equally important. It's another bit of wisdom for Sedon. So that means that regardless of your model of choice, whether you like London Protocol, root cause analysis, or AC maps, if we want to address the human impacts of safety, we need to conceive it in a relational framework. And that's where restorative approaches have a part to play. So Restorative approaches are fundamentally about relationships and people, and they can be proactive, knowing that when you have strong relationships in teams or between people, it makes it easier to repair them when something goes wrong. And they recognise that as humans, we learn from our relationships with each other and within our community. I'm going to talk about this pointy end of the triangle where we think about how we respond when harm occurs for people and relationships in terms of a serious incident. So mostly focusing on death or disability. So the applications of restorative approaches are as a response to an incident or complaint, or as an approach, as we use, to an inquiry. And the aim when we use them in that way is to clarify responsibilities, meet people's needs, and restore well-being as far as reasonably possible, and relationships and trust. Or we can use it as a response to interpersonal conflict. And the aim there is to bring about an environment of safety and belonging, promote reconciliation, and meet the needs of all. And quite often in a serious incident, you will have both of those elements, and you will have conflicts between multiple parties or people. So what exactly is a restorative approach? Well, it's grounded in restorative justice, and I found that many people working in healthcare have a bit of an allergic reaction to the word justice for the reasons I described earlier about that victim-perpetrator model. But essentially, restorative justice involves a voluntary relational process where those in a personal stake in a harmful episode come together in person in a safe and respectful environment, and importantly with the help of skilled facilitators, to speak truthfully about what happened, the impact on their lives, to clarify accountability for those harms, and resolve together how best to promote repair and bring about positive changes. So it's a community response. So restorative justice and approaches affirm the value and the agency of human beings, both individually and as a community of people. And these are the values that underpin the approach. And these values are actually synonymous, I think, with the values that we have as health professionals. Truthfulness, accountability, empowerment, and equal concern. We cannot deliver care without the participation of the patient in terms of decision making and treatment. And also it's about respectful listening and communication in that relationship. So similar to everyday clinical work, our goals include addressing harms and meeting needs in a trusting relationship so that we can promote repair and healing for all involved. And we do that through inclusive, democratic dialogue, because we understand that justice that's lived and experienced isn't pleasant, much like any kind of healthcare if you've been a patient. But we know it will have happened because we'll have lived it rather than having it done to ourselves. So a key feature of a restorative approach is that we appreciate these ripple effects of harm into families and communities and professions and institutions. And we recognise that in complex systems that it is multiple parties, multiple people that are affected, and there are unique needs that emerge from depending on who's involved. So we can't take a checklist approach to how we can help people that are involved, because their needs will be very different. And the people that are affected are not just identified, they're actually included in the dialogue and the design. And to do this, we use restorative practices to achieve these aims. So people tell their personal stories in a safe space, in this face-to-face empathetic conversation, and with independent facilitators, and we try and understand these 4 questions, and you might have seen these before. So we want to ask who has been hurt and what are their needs, who's responsible for the harm and what are their obligations, how can harms be repaired and relationships be made right, and how can we prevent it from happening again. And justice, if we do this, we can uncover people's justice needs. And justice needs are not synonymous with punishment. They're actually about taking a really holistic and caring justice approach that results in meaningful action and apology. And by doing this listening and understanding phase before we act, we can adapt the response to the people involved. So when we think about justice needs, there are substantive needs, so that can be things like access to compensation, treatment or psychosocial support. People will have procedural needs, so that might be inclusion in how the response is going to happen, who's going to be involved, how people want to tell their stories, in what way and to whom. And they might want to meet others involved in the incident as well. And if we do all those things skillfully, then we'll meet these psychological needs for respect to dignity and self-determination. And the apology will be meaningful because we know what it is that we will be apologising for. And how to go about apologising is a lecture in itself, but I just want to kind of highlight that this is often the advice that what we should say to patients, that we're really sorry this has happened to you, to not attribute blame, and to say that we're going to look into it and come back to them. But these types of apologies can often be perceived as being premature and ingenuine because they don't address those justice needs. And I know there are issues around timing and all sorts of other things, very complex. But what providers often say to me is, well, Jo, we've said sorry like 3 times to this person and they're just not listening, they're not hearing us. And usually it's because they haven't uncovered those justice needs and they don't understand what it is that that person needs to hear because they haven't listened, despite the best of intentions. And an apology works because it meets the need for respect. It provides this reassurance of shared values. And there is a need to witness a certain reciprocity of suffering and justice. And we can't appreciate someone's suffering through letters written in what patients and families described in our inquiry as practiced distancing language. We understand it when we come together and we have a conversation, we have a dialogue. And I'm sure you'll all get this, because if you think about a time in your lives where you've needed to repair a relationship or apologise to someone, you wouldn't usually start by asking somebody else to write this objective neutral letter. You'd usually just go and talk to the person and find out what it is that they're seeking from you. So coming back to what is a responsible party? This is the definition that I've developed for our report. So responsible parties they're individuals, they're groups, or they're entities that are identified by the affected parties as having a role to play in the occurrence of the harm and or the reparative and preventative actions required because of the harm, because those can be very different people. So it's not about who's at fault, it's about who are the people in this complex system that actually were involved in the harm. It's not to say that they contributed to it. So let's get on to MESH. Here's the team that designed, delivered and evaluated New Zealand's national restorative response to surgical mesh harm. It includes the chief clinical officers from the Ministry of Health and was commissioned by New Zealand's Chief Medical Officer, Andrew Simpson. And it also included the consumer advocacy group Mesh Down Under. They were equal partners in the design process, and facilitators, very experienced facilitators from our team as well. And the first phase of our project was listening and understanding. To those that have been affected by harm from surgical mesh. So that was patients and families and health professionals. And we use different practices to do that listening and that understanding, so that the ministry and other responsible parties could understand the impacts and also ask what people needed in order to move forward. And people could tell their stories in circles, in facilitated meetings. So we had a couple of those in hospitals and people's own homes because people were so unwell. And also if they wanted to do it in a story database. And people told their stories in all of those different mediums. And some people actually used the meetings and also submitted things to the story base. And interestingly, people told their stories through documents, through photos, by being artifacts like pieces of mesh, poetry. There were lots of different mediums that people utilised to be able to share the impacts on them. So a lot of you be thinking, what's a circle? And circles are a fundamental tool in restorative practice, and we use them to create a safe space for empathetic dialogue. And rather than this free-flowing discussion where you're thinking, oh, how am I going to respond to what that person said, and oh, that person's talking all the time and I want to get a word in edgeways, we actually, it's a very structured way to create a space for dialogue. So we sit in a circle to equalise power relations. We agree the guidelines for discussion. We use a talking piece to confer who has speaking rights. And everyone responds to questions from the facilitator that address human impacts and needs. And it honours everyone's choice to participate in a way that they choose. So if some of you are turning off now and thinking that I sound like a hippie, and you would never in your wildest dreams get senior doctors to sit and do this, I can tell you I have photographic evidence. That is Dr. Aaron Culver, who is New Zealand's clinical lead for mental health. And I would say I've sat in circles, not only for the mesh process, but the number of things that I've done across the health sector, exploring healthcare harm from bullying, from burnout, but also from serious incidents and the impact that incidents have on doctors, nurses, managers and executives. And for the majority, the feedback is they really appreciate the opportunity to speak as a human in a flat structure with people that in their working lives they're often in a hierarchy with. So the second phase of the inquiry brought all these responsible parties or representatives of our responsible parties together with advocates to explore the options for repair and prevention that they'd heard about. And this was the first time that all of the agencies involved in responding to MESH or any safety issue, in fact, had actually come together to collaborate on a topic. And they made commitments at the meeting, which again, we used our practices to deliver. And they agreed to 19 actions that over the next couple of weeks, I liaised with them and we detailed in the report. And they also decided what the governance would look like moving forward, who was going to be responsible for making sure that this happened. So is there any evidence that restorative approaches work? Well, before we talk about health, because it's very emergent in health, just to reassure you that restorative justice in itself is not new. It comes from Indigenous and also religious peoples who've been using it for centuries. But in terms of research, it's actually one of the most researched justice innovations of the last 20 years. And it's proliferated in so many different areas. And these are just some of the people that our team works with, the government agencies we work with because of the successful outcomes. But it is quite new in health, but there is work that's emerging in Canada and Australia and in the UK, predominantly in mental health settings in the UK and Australia, and in other settings here and in Canada. So, but it's not, to our knowledge, been used on this scale before to respond to healthcare harm. So we wanted to evaluate people's experiences of the process and the immediate impacts of the approach. So we did that we did a descriptive evaluation within a health impacts assessment framework, so that there was space for outcome evaluation in the future. And we collected data using tools that were designed based on what people's hopes and wishes were at the start of the process. And we've written that up and released it to the government, and it's currently under review before it's released publicly, but I have got permission to share some results with you today. So in terms of who participated in our evaluation, it included patients and families, and that survey there, actually we had a reasonable response rate, but that represented almost 50% of the people that participated in the inquiry, and a large number of people that participated in circles. And the interviews was really interesting because we invited anyone who attended that planning and acting group and anyone that attended a circle as a responsible party to come and talk to us. That was 21 people, and I've done a number of sensitive research projects. I was amazed. There was no gatekeeper problems, and everybody was just so keen to come and talk about their experiences. It was fantastic. So what do we find? Well, before the inquiry, there was this really adversarial relationship between consumers and the government, because every step of the way, patients had to fight and prove they were telling the truth, and they felt heard and believed. And we found that using the restorative practices in the design process and in the planning and acting phase actually enhanced collaboration and built trust through this, because it supported this collective decision making. And there was real honesty there around what was possible and what wasn't. And there continues to be a largely positive relationship, an ongoing working relationship. I'm not going to say it's perfect, because you'll all know I'm talking nonsense, because anyone that's had any kind of relationship knows that there will be pitfalls in the road. So how do we go with the listening and understanding phase? Well, we found that restorative approaches and practices actually supported those justice needs to be met during this phase of the project for most people, including patients, families and responsible parties, that they created safe and supportive conditions that were characterised by care and compassion, because they brought people together. And for those of you that might have some doubt about passing a talking piece around, it was actually mentioned positively by quite a lot of people for both the right to speak and the opportunity to listen. And providing these multiple options, as we did, in different ways for people to tell their stories, actually worked for the majority of people. It allowed them to tell their story in a way that worked for them, and often more than once. So did people feel heard and supported? Well, the preservation of dignity and validation of experience and respectful communication were experienced by most people. And these are the words that both patients, families and responsible parties use to describe the process. So non-adversarial, it allowed them to be vulnerable. Responsible parties talked about that a lot. They felt that they could be there as a human and respond as a human instead of with their role hat on. And interestingly, patients and families said they felt heard and supported equally, both by the facilitation team, the responsible parties in the circle, and being with other mesh injured people was particularly supportive for the majority of people, although there were a small number that said that they felt sort of vicariously traumatized by hearing other people's stories. For most people, that was a great source of strength. And interestingly, feeling heard and supported by those responsible parties was actually statistically associated with regaining some trust in those meetings. And you can see that how that's illustrated here in this quote. I was really surprised that the Ministry of Health representatives were so engaging and supportive I'd not expected that. I guess I thought they'd be superior and unfeeling and defensive, but the opposite was the case, and they're exactly the right people for the job. So when we come together, we stop imagining this evil, nasty people that are trying, that aren't wanting to help us. So in the second phase, remembering it brought everybody together with the advocates to make some actions for repair and prevention. And this was over the course of one day. And most people said they would have preferred more time for that phase. But that was largely so they could influence their agency to make the commitments that were desired. One interpretation of that is that people that are very much removed from listening to and understanding those human impacts are less motivated to do so, in the same way that James Reason talks about the further away you are from the sharp end, the easier it is to think that everything's safe and well in your organisation. And the people that attended and actually heard from patients themselves, they said that people really need to be there, because reading stories can be effective, but it pales in comparison to sitting with someone and then telling you about how their life has changed and the impact it's had. And it makes you say, right, we've got to do something here. And that's just like sitting at the bedside with a patient and hearing about the impact of the disease on their lives. Interestingly, the responsible parties said that they'd been deeply affected, and they'd also observed a profound effect on their colleagues that had motivated them and others in ways that they said reports do not, and at a speed that they said was faster than usual. And that's really important, because this intrinsic motivation that we get from empathetic listening appears to be a more powerful tool to get things moving and implement the actions than being told to by a regulator or a policy maker. And this is a kolu. It's one of our most iconic plant species, and I think about it when I think about restoring relationships and well-being, because when you give it as a gift, it symbolizes the beginning of a new relationship or a new phase in a relationship, and it suggests growth and harmony and new beginnings. And when we think about whether the inquiry met the needs of restoration of well-being and relationships, we found that patients and families were unsure if their needs and the needs of others would be met, or safe healthcare would occur in the future. And that was because there was still waiting for their substantive needs, particularly around compensation and mesh removal, because one of the outcomes was to set up specialist mesh clinics, and obviously that takes quite a long time, and we collected our data within 6 months of the project finishing. But that is really important, as is a meaningful apology and delivery on the actions before they can definitively say, yes, you've restored my trust. While responsible parties were concerned about their ability to meet needs, it was usually because of legislation or policy, or sometimes an individual patient's circumstances. And that suggests that regardless of the inquiry approach that we use, we do need to focus our understanding on the enablers that provide this healing for people after harm. And you can see that in the Barings-Cumberligis report as well. And only a very small number of people still wanted to pursue retributive action towards a surgeon. They were in the minority. Some wanted to actually have a restorative conference, and that suggests with their surgeons, suggesting that this restoring the therapeutic relationship is actually quite important in our response to an incident, particularly as people with a disability are going to need ongoing care. So more work to do before this kolu can uncoil in all its beauty. So does a restorative approach support system learning? Well, yes, it does. A comparison of our findings and recommendations with other inquiries that used a traditional approach found that we came up with very similar findings and recommendations with some contextual nuances depending on the system. So storytelling, and other people have written about this, including Drew Ray and Ian Padilli, can actually provide this rich information for system learning and improvement. And more importantly, as I said before, because the community involved, it's more likely to occur. So, is restorative justice just talking to people? No, we can't pick up a checklist and just go and talk to harm patients and families and professionals. We have to recognise that people are deeply traumatised and are often grieving. And we found that there are some things that really help with these conversations: the use of independent skilled facilitators, preparation of the parties, all the parties that are involved is really important, and tailored emotional support. All of those factors are really critical for success. These are considered best practice standards in restorative approaches. And also importantly, we need to think about the fact that a small number of patients indicated that that there was some harm from the process. So for example, sitting in a circle, our team and the responsible parties, this was emotionally challenging. So we need further research to understand, you know, what works, how, in which conditions, and for whom when we're applying the approach. So in conclusion, we found that a key strength is the procedural adaptation. It makes it much easier to meet people's needs as they change over time, as they go through this journey and respond to context. We found that the approach does have the potential to meet justice needs in ways that current ones do not, and is potentially transferable to other contexts outside of mesh, and that healing after harm is possible within a relational framework and should be embedded alongside regulation and policy and procedure. And to do that, you're going to need support from senior decision makers. And before you think, well, this is all to do with the fact that you're in New Zealand, because I often get told it only works in New Zealand because of our cultural identity, no fault, no blame legislation, and even the amazing Jacinda Ardern. But a restorative just culture has proven to be hugely beneficial in an NHS trust. It's led to, amongst other things, a reduction in suspensions and dismissals, an increase in reporting of incidents, and a huge economic benefit of 2% of labour costs. And if that doesn't convince you that there is some argument there, I'm not sure what your legal and dispute resolution costs are in the UK and in your other countries, but here in New Zealand they're in the millions, and early resolution costs a lot less than significant legal fees. So finally, a word of caution. Like tramping in New Zealand, people just wander off into the wilderness here and to the beautiful places that we have. A restorative approach requires a huge practical and emotional commitment from the people involved. It's not an easy approach in terms, especially when there's significant harm. The greater the harm, the longer it's been compounded, the greater the skill is needed to be able to promote healing and prevent further harm, and often the longer the journey. However, this emerging evidence does suggest that this exploration is a worthy endeavour, and there's a number of things that we're doing next to move forward in New Zealand, which I will leave for questions, and stop talking at you now and have some dialogue. Oh my God, I hope you're not going to see my desktop. Thanks,
that was wonderful. Thank you so much, Jo. This is where, if we could, we would be applauding you, but take it as read. I'm sure you would get a huge applause now. So we have had, oh look, there we go, applause. So we have had a few questions, and I'm sure that we might get some more coming in. My first observation is just having sat with you in a virtual restorative circle. Yeah. It is a bit weird, but it is really good as well. And totally as you describe it, that it, you know, supports listening to others. So on that note, I will go to some questions. So there's a lot of interest. There's a question here from Suzanne Shale, who said, I'd be interested to hear more about the listening circles. How do you prepare for those and support the participants or train the facilitators? And also, how many people do you have in these sorts of circles?
Great question, thanks, Suzanne. So in terms of the number of people in this particular project, we try to aim for 10 to 12 patients and family members. People are allowed to bring a support person with them, and then we would have 2 or 3 responsible parties, representatives of the responsible parties. We work in a co-facilitation model, so there will be 2 facilitators, somebody providing emotional support, was a trained social worker, and then I went to all but 3 just to capture verbatim what people said throughout the process. In terms of preparation, for the circles that we did as part of this piece of work, because there was such a huge amount of people, we did that through a letter, but also they could call. So some people would phone and clarify operational details, but other people, my colleague who's a facilitator and a social worker, spent a number of hours talking to people. In terms of the facilitated meetings, they were all phone calls, and normally in the preparation for a restorative process, it's not just one meeting. You can have a number of meetings, and it does make or break the session when you bring people together, how well prepared they are for it, and an understanding of what the ground rules, if you like, will be. Because as I said, we don't want to create any further harm from the process.
Great. I hope that answers your question, Suzanne. I can see you've turned on your video there. Great. Okay, so we've got another really interesting question here from Rebecca Myers. And she is saying that we often present an idealised view of healthcare, which then can go on to create disappointment or unmet expectations for patients. But that can also then mean that, you know, how we respond as healthcare practitioners, that can make us defensive or angry. And what she's proposing then is, what do you think, Jo, might happen if we were to be more honest about the sort of inherently risky or emotionally intense nature of healthcare, and that we can't totally control what goes on or guarantee that things won't happen again?
Gosh, that's a big question.
Yes.
So I do agree with that. I think the discourse around safety, that we can have an environment of zero harm, is just, there's the evidence in safety science, as you know, Jane, that's not possible. And I think we do need to be more honest about that. When we think about mesh in particular, patients were having that inserted with what they later saw to be a lack of consent, because they weren't told that it was a medical device that was fairly new to the market, and quite often the clinicians may not have used that much. However, from the clinician perspective, this is something that's been rubber stamped as being safe by the FDA. So, I mean, that's a really good example of how, despite all of that, there's these different parts of the chain that have fell over. I think this is a really emotive conversation. Quite often when we have it with harmed patients and families, there will be some people that will be absolutely insistent that harm should never occur, and it should never have occurred to them or their family member. And I very much empathise with that with that position. So I think, yes, we do need a public discourse that starts acknowledging that harm does happen, because we need that to be able to say, okay, how do we respond to it in a way that recognises there are all these emotions involved? It's actually really traumatic for the people who are impacted by it. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, it's a great question. We could probably have a whole session just on that one, couldn't we?
We could.
We have a really interesting question here from Cornelia Stewart. And I have a particular interest in this question. In your experience, is the approaches that you describe, are they used as an alternative to investigations, or are they used in conjunction with, or just in circumstances where there's a need to repair relationships?
You can do, it depends. The classic healthcare answer. So in the inquiry, for example, we followed a restorative inquiry approach. As I said, in terms of what we found and what was recommended, was very similar to that legal formal inquiry approach in Australia and in the UK. I've also walked alongside a family who went through the formal investigative process and went to our Health and Disability Commissioner, who's responsible for reviewing breaches of patients' rights and coming to a decision about whether or not they were breached. So they went through those investigative processes, but we used a restorative approach to maintain and repair the relationship with the health provider in which that occurred while we were doing it. And actually, by doing that, we got the needs of the family met through that process, because anyone who's gone through coronial process investigation that involves a legal expert, they go on for about 3 years. So in that particular case, the family's needs were met way before the regulator's decision came through. And when the regulator's decision came through, it wasn't really that important, because the hospital had already taken responsibility and met their justice needs and said, we're really sorry for failing you and your family. That was their apology, which was just brilliant. And it was better than the first 3 that sent them to the regulator in the first place.
Brilliant. Thank you. There's a couple of questions which are about the sort of practicalities of using these type of approaches.
Yeah.
So David Vaughan was asking about whether restorative approaches, whether you know of or have used restorative approaches in a virtual remote context, or whether they are something that has to happen face to face. And also we've had some questions about the training for facilitators and what that might be, what that needs to be.
Yeah, okay, so let's take the virtual one first. So really interestingly, we don't do reactive conferences virtually. We do preparation meetings virtually, but the actual meeting we would have in person. I think that's really, we feel that's really important. But I am aware of some of my colleagues in Europe who have been forced into that method of late, who have found it more beneficial than they had expected. In terms of the proactive approaches, as you described earlier, Jane, you've been in some of my proactive circles, which are all about building group norms and creating a sense of connection between people. And actually the conversations get quite deep, because people share their vulnerabilities, as I'm sure you've experienced. So you can do that virtually online as well. In terms of training, this is the big question really, because I guess one of the things that worries me is that we have a really good track record in healthcare of picking stuff up and saying, well, I'm a clinician, so I can do this. So in terms of training, I had formal training. You can do an accreditation here in New Zealand. I don't know what it's like in other countries. Coaching. I told my staff, I actually started using it with staff in an environment where we had significant patient harm, bullying behaviour, and concerns about speaking up. I told my staff that I was going to be using it, that it was new to me, that I was going to get it wrong, and was just really transparent about it. And we did some circles. So I had coaching through that whole process, and that was really important. So people tend to do a formal training about 5 days, and then work with a supervisor to facilitate in the work that we're doing. It's hard to find health specific training.
It's maybe a niche for you to provide some sort of global training for these restorative approaches. Okay, I'm aware that we're coming towards the end of our time, but I have one last question, and it's quite meaty, from Alison Coolman, our colleague. And she says that she's curious whether it is appropriate to use the term restorative or restorative justice if its use excludes some of the affected parties. For example, if an organisation uses restorative practices within the organisation, but not with patients and the public, her view is that restorative justice is that it is an inclusive process, so that it should be including all parties. What would you say to that?
I think I know what Ali's getting at there, which is that if you think about the sort of the theoretical work in the international space has been developed. Sidney Decker's work, which is really seminal, important work, but it has been developed with health professionals and organisations in mind. I think that patients and families that have felt that they're the second thought, the add-on thought. And Ali's absolutely right. When we actually approach an incident of harm, sorry, I was getting distracted by, I think, my colleague Elizabeth from New Zealand. When we approach an episode of harm, the most important question is to ask who's been affected here. So when we think about Jack Adcock, that case of the child who died earlier, you've got the doctor, you've got the nurse, you've got the team, you've got the organisation on that side, but you've got the family, you've got his friends, their families, the schools. It's multiple people that it impacts. So we really should be thinking from that frame of equity, because that is one of the values that underpins the approach. Good question, Ali. Thank you.
Okay, well, we have come to the end of our time. I feel like we could go on and on talking to you about this, but I do just want to extend the biggest thank you to you, Jo, for getting up so early in the morning in New Zealand to come and talk to us. We really appreciate it. This recording will be made available on our YouTube YQSR channel, but for now we will wish you a very lovely Friday, and that's it. Thank you everyone for coming along.
Thanks, Jane, and thanks everyone. And I've seen some messages in the chat from practitioners as well, so message me on Twitter for answers to those questions. And thanks, Jane, for supporting our work, even at the beginning when some people thought I was nuts. I appreciate it.
We like crazy, don't we? Brilliant. Do you want to stay online, Jo, for a minute?
Yeah,
and we
I
can
will.
Just have a debrief. Fabulous.
Thanks so much.